My phone didn't buzz, it detonated. One second I was in a glass tower in Boston prepping for the biggest pitch of my career. And the next I was staring at a police alert telling me my Land Cruiser had been found abandoned 170 miles from my locked garage. Not stolen by strangers. Not taken in an emergency. No, someone in my own family had ripped it from my house. Driven it across state lines. And then lied about it to the police. I thought that was the betrayal. But that was before I learned what they were using my SUV for, and who they were pretending I was. I wasn't born into chaos. At least, that's what I used to tell myself. But looking back now, I realize I was raised in a family where silence was survival. Usefulness was love. And the role you played mattered more than the person you were. My name is Ethan Ward. And for most of my life, I was the dependable one, the kid who followed through, fixed problems, and apologized first. Not because I was noble, but because it was easier than being punished for disrupting the family balance. The Wards were a trio long before I arrived. My father, Leonard, carried himself like a man owed respect simply for existing. My mother, Carol, wielded guilt like a conductor's baton, orchestrating every conversation, mood, and obligation. And then there was my brother, Noah, the son around which our household revolved. The golden boy. The one whose mistakes were learning experiences and whose accomplishments were exaggerated until they reached mythological status. My place in the hierarchy was clear from the start. Noah mattered. I maintained. It's strange how labels stick to you long after childhood ends. To them, I remained the quiet kid who didn't need much. The one who got straight A's without praise. The one who grew into a man they barely noticed unless they needed something fixed, funded, or forgiven. I wasn't invisible. I was infrastructure. When I was 17, I got my first job at a marina, hauling ropes, washing decks, doing whatever was needed. I saved every dollar for nearly a year to buy a beat-up Jeep Cherokee with rust along the doors and mismatched tires. It wasn't pretty, but it was mine. I'd never had anything that was truly, unequivocally mine before. 3 months later, Noah borrowed it to impress a girl. He totaled it after running a stop sign. The insurance barely covered half. My parents covered the rest. But not without reminding me daily that family helps family, and I should be grateful. Somehow, the debt belonged to me, even though the crash had been entirely Noah's fault. That was the first time I learned generosity in my family was always a loan. Never a gift, and the repayment was submission. I tried leaving the dynamic behind when I left for college. I double majored, worked part-time, earned scholarships, and graduated with job offers from 2 major firms. My parents barely attended my graduation. They left after the ceremony because Noah had a softball game. He was 24. It was a men's league. Still, I convinced myself it didn't matter. I was building my own life, my own stability, my own rules. But blood has a way of crawling through locked doors. By the time I turned 30, I had the career I dreamed of, a home I was proud of, and financial freedom my younger self couldn't have imagined. To my family, that meant one thing: a new resource had opened. When Noah struggled with his bills, just this once I paid the rent. When my parents fell behind on their utilities, I covered those too. When my dad's truck needed repairs, somehow my credit card ended up on file at the mechanic. If I refused, they acted confused, offended, or disappointed, whichever emotion would manipulate fastest. But most of the time, I didn't refuse. I kept peace like it was my religion. There was one person who cut through the fog of that household: my grandfather, Henry. Quiet, stubborn, and sharp-minded even into his 80s. He was everything the rest of them weren't: fair, honest, grounded. When I visited him as a kid, he taught me how to fix engines, tie knots, repair fence lines. But more importantly, he taught me something I didn't understand until I was older: Ethan. He'd say, anyone who needs your loyalty will never demand it. Only takers do that. He was the first person who made me feel like more than a tool. When he passed away, he left me a small inheritance, just enough to put a down payment on the house I live in now. My parents never forgave that. They said it was unfair that I'd been favored. They implied I'd manipulated an old man. For years after his funeral, anytime I denied one of their requests, they'd mention Grandpa Henry's money, as though I owed them penance for being included in his will. The truth is, the more successful I became, the less they saw me as a son, and the more they saw me as an ATM with emotions that could be bypassed by guilt or noise. The requests turned into expectations. The expectations turned into demands. And the demands became the foundation of every interaction we had. There were signs early on, small, almost imperceptible moments where their entitlement slipped into the open. Like the time Noah borrowed my toolkit and never returned it. When I asked for it back, my mother scolded me for being materialistic. Or the time my father took my old laptop without asking, insisting that you're doing well. You can afford another. Or when my mother used my credit card accidentally to buy decorations for a church fundraiser after she saved the number to her phone for emergencies. The pattern was simple. If it was mine, it was theirs. If I refused, I was selfish. If I enabled them, I was a good son. People talk about manipulation like it's loud and dramatic. It isn't. It's subtle. It's rehearsed. It's carved into routines so normal you don't notice they're strangling you until the rope tightens. Still, I tolerated it. I endured it. I convinced myself it was temporary. That once Noah got back on his feet, things would change. Or once my parents retired, they'd relax. But takers never relax. They escalate. And the escalation became unmistakable when I bought the Land Cruiser, a vehicle I'd saved for, researched, and customized. I was proud of it. I protected it. It represented independence carved out through years of sacrifice. To them, it represented an opportunity. The first time they hinted at using it, my mother said, "It's silly for a car that big to sit in a garage when we could take it to the lake." I told her no. She laughed like I'd said something ridiculous. When I changed the garage code, my father asked why I was being paranoid. Noah joked that I was turning into one of those stingy rich guys. But even then, I believed naively that if I explained my boundaries clearly, they'd respect them. That illusion shattered the morning my phone lit up with the Wilmington impound alert. And I realized, with perfect clarity, something I should have understood years earlier. They never respected my boundaries because they never believed I was allowed to have any. What happened with the SUV wasn't a one-time slip. It was the natural evolution of a family that had always viewed my belongings as communal property and my success as a shared asset. And now, for the first time in my life, I was ready to look directly at the truth instead of explaining it away. I wasn't the quiet one. I wasn't the responsible one. I wasn't the supportive one. I was the exploited one. And they had finally pushed the system too far. The thing about pressure is that it rarely arrives all at once. It creeps in quiet and consistent until one day you look around and realize you've been living under a weight so heavy it feels normal. In the weeks leading up to the SUV incident, and the demands from my family didn't just increase, they multiplied. It started subtly. My mother called one night while I was preparing a quarterly report. "Ethan, honey, could you cover the electric bill this month? Your father's pension deposit was delayed." She said it with the same tone someone might use to ask for a glass of water. I told her I'd help this time, but they needed to start budgeting more carefully. "Budgeting," she repeated, like she'd never heard the word before. Then came the sigh that disappointed. Wounded sigh she'd perfected over years of practice. "Ethan, we raised you. We supported you. And now you're nickel and diming your own parents." The guilt landed exactly where she aimed it. It always did. A few days later, Noah reached out. He rarely called unless his life was on fire. So when his name appeared on my screen, I already knew what was coming. "Bro, listen, can you spot me $400? I had to pay for a tow. And rent is due tomorrow." I told him no. Calmly, clearly, for the first time in a long time. His response, "Damn, you really changed. Man, ever since you got that promotion, you think you're better than us." There, it was the accusation meant to shame me back into compliance. But something in me hardened. I didn't apologize. I didn't explain. I simply ended the call. That should have been the warning shot. But they weren't done. The real shift came at a Sunday dinner I reluctantly attended. I'd missed the last three, and my mother made sure to emphasize how absent I'd become. When I arrived, the tension in the house felt thick enough to slice. Noah greeted me like a man irritated by a late paycheck. "You brought the Land Cruiser?" he asked, peeking past me toward the driveway. "No," I answered. "Took the sedan." He frowned. "Why? What's the point of owning a big car and never letting anyone use it? It's not like you have kids or a family." My jaw tightened. "It's my vehicle." "Noah." He smirked. Not at the words, but at the fact that I felt the need to say them. At the dinner table, the conversation turned into an audit of my choices. "You're always working," my father said, slicing into his pot roast. "You should take us on a vacation sometime. Something nice. You can afford it." "Yeah," Noah added. "Tyler took his family to Turks and Caicos last year. That's what real men do when they're successful. They treat their family." My mother chimed in. "We've sacrificed so much for you. Ethan, you act like we're strangers." In that moment, I realized something unsettling. They genuinely believed that my accomplishments, my income, even my personal belongings, they were part of a communal pool they had permanent access to. Not because they needed help, because they felt entitled to it. I left that night with a tightness in my chest I couldn't quite explain. For most of my life, I thought I was just the quiet, responsible son. But now, I could feel the dynamic twisting into something darker. My boundaries weren't just ignored, they were resented. Every no was treated as betrayal. Every yes was expected. The pressure intensified when I made a decision that should have been ordinary. I changed the garage code. I had just invested in a new security system after a break-in in my neighborhood. Nothing dramatic, just a standard update. But when my father discovered he couldn't enter the garage during an unannounced visit, he called me in a fury. "You locked us out of your own home. What are you hiding?" "Ethan, I'm not hiding anything," I said. "I'm just updating the security. I'll give you the new code if you need it." "If we need it," he repeated. "We're family. We should have full access." The phrasing struck me like a slap. Full access. To my home. To my things. To my life. A week later, I found the back door of my house unlocked. I always triple-check my doors. It wasn't a mistake. My father admitted he had used the spare key to check on things. There was no emergency. He didn't even apologize. That was when the moral line began to blur. I'd always known they were entitled, but now the entitlement edged into something invasive, violating, predatory. The tension culminated 2 days before I flew to Boston. My mother called me in tears because Noah's car had broken down and he needed to borrow mine for a few days. "No," I said firmly. "Why?" she demanded. "Because I need it." And because I said no. My father grabbed the phone. "You're being selfish. You don't even use that vehicle half the time." I repeated my answer. I could hear the disappointment morphing into anger through the receiver. "Fine," he said. "If that's the way you want to be." There was a tone in his voice I couldn't decode at the time. A quiet, simmering certainty. Looking back, it was the sound of a man who had already decided to take what he believed was his. The next morning, I found the hook on the key rack in my kitchen empty. Not just the car key, the spare set I had hidden months earlier. I searched everywhere, convinced I must have misplaced them. But I hadn't. Someone had found them. I changed the garage code that night. I double-checked every lock. And I flew to Boston the following morning with a gnawing sense that something was about to snap. I just didn't know the snapping point would come from 170 miles away and arrive as a police impound alert. And the moment I saw it, every vague doubt crystallized into a single truth. They hadn't crossed a boundary, they'd bulldozed it. And now they expected me to pay the repair bill. When I landed back in Charleston after the impound call, I wasn't angry. Not yet. Anger still implied some level of shock or disappointment. And I was far past both. What I felt was closer to detachment. Like I was watching someone else's life unravel from a safe distance. But the moment I saw my Land Cruiser in person, really saw it, the detachment cracked. The SUV sat behind the chain-link gate of the impound lot, sun-bleached and grimy, as if the weekend joyride had aged it years. When the attendant buzzed me in, the metallic groan of the gate felt like the soundtrack to a burial. I approached slowly, taking inventory. The deep gouge along the passenger side, like someone had dragged a beach chair or cooler against the paint without a second thought. The sand-packed floor mats, the half-eaten fast food wrappers stuffed into the door, and the smell a sour mix of sunscreen, sweat, and cheap rum hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't use. It wasn't borrowing. This was desecration. The car wasn't just dirty. It felt violated, like they'd taken something sacred and treated it like trash. I gripped the door handle, and for the first time all day, a tremor ran through my hand. Not fear, not sadness, recognition. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of a lifetime of being treated like a resource instead of a person. I climbed in, turned the key, and the engine grumbled awake. As I pulled out of the lot, a moment hit me with such force that I remember the exact angle of the sunlight on the windshield. They never intended to return the car before I found out. They intended to return it before I could stop them. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a calculated gamble, a risk they felt entitled to take because historically I cleaned up after them. That was the moment I broke. Not in a loud, explosive way. No yelling, no threats, just a clean internal snap silent. Irreversible. By the time I pulled into my parents' driveway, I had rehearsed every possible version of the conversation. They'd deny it. They'd rewrite the narrative. They'd blame me. They'd insist it was family property. What I didn't rehearse was the hostility. My mother stormed toward me the second I crossed the threshold. Her face was contorted with a fury I hadn't seen since childhood, except this time. It wasn't directed at a misbehaving kid. It was directed at me for daring to expose their actions to consequences. "How could you?" she screamed. "Calling the police on us. Leaving us stranded like criminals," my father added. "You embarrassed this family. You made us look like thieves." I looked at them, baffled, genuinely baffled, because I realized they believed, wholeheartedly, that I was the one who'd crossed a line. Not them, not the theft, not the lies. Me, because I didn't fix the mess quietly. In their eyes, I had committed the only sin that mattered. I'd made their behavior visible. That's when the truth finally clarified itself into a single, unshakable thought. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a lapse in judgment. This was who they were and who they had always been. The person I had been, the son who bent, who compensated, who rationalized, died in that living room. I walked out without raising my voice, without defending myself, without attempting negotiation, not out of weakness, out of certainty. Certainty that something fundamental had shifted. Certainty that there was no going back. Certainty that I would never let them cross another line again. Everything after that was consequence. And consequences, unlike second chances, aren't negotiable. The strange thing about clarity is how quiet it feels. There was no anger left in me when I got home, no trembling, no frantic pacing, no replaying the confrontation in my head. What settled over me instead was a cold, precise calm, a feeling I'd never associated with myself before. Control. I hung my blazer on the chair, opened my laptop, and pulled up a spreadsheet. I didn't start with emotions. I started with numbers. For years, I had been the invisible scaffolding of my family's day-to-day life. The backup payment method, the emergency fund, the convenient solution they never acknowledged but always assumed. Now, with my fingers hovering above the keyboard, I looked at every line item with the eyes of a stranger conducting an audit. Amazon subscriptions, veterinary bills, streaming services, utility accounts linked to mine temporarily, a printer lease no one never returned. I canceled each one with the same steady breath, the same unshakable certainty. It didn't feel vindictive. It felt overdue. The next step wasn't impulsive, it was strategic. I contacted my insurance provider, flagged the Land Cruiser for unauthorized use, and removed every secondary driver from the policy. When the representative asked if I wanted to keep my parents listed just in case, I almost laughed. No, I said. Effective immediately. My voice didn't shake. Then came the email. Not emotional. Not accusatory. Not written in the language of someone pleading to be understood. A clean, professional, corporate-style memo. Subject regarding unauthorized use of vehicle and assets body effective today. All forms of access previously granted to any member of the Ward family have been revoked. This includes keys, garage access, digital codes, financial accounts, linked subscriptions, insurance permissions. Unauthorized entry or use of my property will be treated as trespassing or theft. This is non-negotiable. No greetings. No sign-off. Just the kind of cold clarity they had earned. I sent it at 3:14 p.m. and didn't think about it again. 2 hours later, my doorbell rang. At first, I expected my father ready for round two, armed with righteous indignation. Instead, when I opened the door, I found the only person in my family I'd ever truly trusted, Uncle Ray. He stood on my porch in his old denim jacket, hands in his pockets, expression heavy, not with judgment, but concern. Mind if I come in? Kid, he asked. I wasn't a kid, but hearing it from him still softened something in my chest. I stepped aside. He didn't lecture me. He didn't defend them. He didn't try to negotiate peace. Instead, he sat at my kitchen table, looked me dead in the eyes, and said, I heard what happened. I would have done the same damn thing. The exhale that left my body felt like something sacred, like someone had finally pulled a thorn I'd been carrying for decades. I told him everything. The towing, the lies, the confrontation, the way they'd cornered me my entire life and called it love. He listened the way only people who've lived through similar storms can listen, quiet, present, without trying to fix or minimize anything. When I finished, he nodded slowly. Your grandfather warned me they'd do this to you one day. He said, you're your own man now. And they hate that. They only understand one kind of language, losing privileges. He tapped the countertop with 2 fingers. You didn't betray them. Ethan, you stopped participating. Those words sank in deep, rerouting something fundamental inside me. For years, I'd believed that stepping away made me cruel, that withholding financial help made me selfish. But now I saw it clearly. Withholding what you're being exploited for isn't cruelty. It's self-respect. Uncle Ray stayed for nearly an hour. Before leaving, he squeezed my shoulder. Don't back down, he said. They're going to test the fences, but you're doing the right thing. When he drove off, the sun was setting behind the trees, painting the yard gold. I felt the shift inside me, subtle but undeniable. I wasn't the exploited son anymore. I wasn't the fallback plan. I wasn't the family infrastructure. I was a man who understood the value of his own boundaries and the cost of breaking them. The next morning, the silence in my house felt different. Static-free. Clean. Like the quiet after a storm that had lasted far too long. For the first time in years, I didn't wake up dreading a missed call, a guilt trip, an emergency that wasn't mine. I woke up knowing I had finally stepped into a version of myself I should have been all along. Someone no one could misuse again. The confrontation didn't happen in a living room, or a driveway, or any of the familiar battlegrounds where my family traditionally staged their dramas. It happened at the Charleston Harbor Convention Center. Of all places, a polished, echoing building filled with marble, glass, and the low hum of a financial expo I was scheduled to attend for work. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was there to discuss strategy and asset protection. My family was there because they wanted to reclaim the assets they believed they owned. I saw them before they saw me. My father, Leonard, storming across the lobby in a rumpled polo, as though he were marching into court on a case he knew he'd already lost, but refused to drop. My mother, Carol, looking everywhere at once, scanning the crowd for an audience who might validate her outrage. And Noah trailing behind them, restless, embarrassed, but still ready to play whatever role benefited him most. They looked small against the towering glass atrium. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel smaller in comparison. I felt grounded, centered, untouchable. They didn't approach quietly. Subtlety was never their specialty. Ethan, my mother's voice cracked across the lobby like a whip. We need to talk. Now. Heads turned. People watched. My mother loved an audience. But she didn't understand that I wasn't a character in her drama anymore. Before I could respond, a man in a navy suit intercepted them. My attorney, Daniel Pierce, a calm, meticulous strategist with the demeanor of someone who had never once raised his voice and never needed to. Daniel had arrived 5 minutes earlier, right on schedule. He positioned himself between us like a shield as he extended a hand to my father. Mr. Ward. Mrs. Ward. I'm Daniel Pierce, counsel for Ethan. The confusion on their faces morphed into instant hostility. Counsel, my father scoffed. We're his family. He doesn't need a lawyer to talk to his own parents. Daniel didn't flinch. In most families. No. But in this situation, given the police report, the financial withdrawals, and the unauthorized use of his assets, it's necessary. My mother drew herself up like she'd just been slapped. Unauthorized, she repeated. We're his parents. Everything he has is because of us. The line rang through the lobby, bouncing off the marble. A few attendees paused, half listening as they walked by. Daniel maintained his professional neutrality, regardless of your perception. The law does not recognize familial entitlement over legally owned property. He opened a sleek black folder. I didn't need to look to know what was inside. The police report, the towing invoices, the custodial account withdrawal, the cease and desist letter I'd sent, and a printed list of every instance they had accessed my assets without permission. My entire history of quiet exploitation, organized paragraph by paragraph, line by line. My father's face reddened, the telltale sign that the situation had escaped his control. You put all this together like we're criminals. He growled. Daniel looked him dead in the eye. I didn't put this together. Ethan did. That was the moment they turned their fury on me. You ungrateful brat, Carol snapped. We raised you, Leonard shouted. You're doing all this over a car, Noah muttered, his voice small. I let them finish. Not because I was intimidated, because I wanted to look at them fully. Clearly, without the fog of obligation. When I finally spoke, my voice didn't rise. It didn't shake. It didn't plead. I'm doing this, I said, because what you took wasn't a car. You took my autonomy. You took my boundaries. You took years of my life and called it love. They stared at me like the words were in another language. For once, I continued. You don't get to rewrite what happened. Daniel handed my father a set of documents. These are formal notices, he explained. Any further unauthorized access to Ethan's property, home, vehicle, financial accounts, or personal information will result in legal action. Protective orders have been drafted and are ready to file if needed. My mother's mouth dropped open. You're going to drag your own family into court. No, I said. I'm going to protect myself. You're the ones who will decide whether court is necessary. There was a beat of stunned silence. They weren't shocked by the words, they were shocked that I finally meant them. My father stepped forward, puffed up, ready to unleash another tirade. But he froze when Daniel slid one final document across the table. A notarized statement revoking all emergency access and legal authority they had ever held regarding my property. Leonard's entire posture deflated. For a man who thrived on control, losing it wasn't just frustrating, it was humiliating. My mother sank onto a lobby bench, my shoulders trembling not with sadness, but outrage. The humiliation was sinking in. People were watching, and for once, I didn't run to rescue them from embarrassment. Noah stared at the floor, realizing there was no path for him to talk his way out, joke his way out, or charm his way out. Daniel gathered the documents into a neat stack. This concludes our discussion. If you attempt contact outside approved channels, we will escalate accordingly. He stepped back and nodded at me. It was my turn to close the door. I'm not abandoning you, I said. I'm ending the cycle. If you ever choose to have a real relationship, one based on respect, not entitlement, I'm open to that. But until then, this is where our old dynamic ends. My mother lifted her head, eyes burning with betrayal. "You're choosing them over us," she whispered. "No," I replied softly. "I'm choosing myself." I walked away, the convention hall swallowing me in its hum of voices and polished air. Daniel at my side. Behind me. I didn't hear footsteps. I didn't hear apologies. I didn't even hear shouting. Just silence. The kind that follows a collapse. The kind that comes when a structure finally falls under its own weight. And for the first time in my life, that silence felt like freedom. In the weeks after the confrontation at the convention center, the storm didn't return. It simply dissipated. Not because they changed, but because there was nowhere left for their chaos to land. My parents tried a few more tactics: blocked numbers, vague messages through distant relatives, Facebook posts dripping with martyrdom, but none of it reached me. The boundaries weren't theoretical anymore. They were reinforced by paperwork, by consequences, and by a version of myself they no longer recognized or controlled. Without my financial support, their world shrank quickly. Noah had to take on a second job. My father sold his fishing boat, the one he'd always said was the family's, though no one but him ever touched it. My mother stopped donating my money to charities she selected purely for social clout. They weren't ruined, but they were finally living within the limits of their own decisions. And surprisingly, the person I worried about least was the one who weathered it best: Uncle Ray. He checked in occasionally, not to pry, but to make sure I didn't mistake solitude for abandonment. His steady presence reminded me that choosing boundaries wasn't the same thing as choosing isolation. As for me, something shifted internally. The silence in my life no longer felt like waiting for the next crisis. It felt like oxygen. I reclaimed my time, my money, my weekends. I restored my home to a place of rest rather than intrusion. I opened the garage door each morning and saw my Land Cruiser, polished, repaired, and finally under my control, without anyone else's fingerprints. On a warm Saturday afternoon, I drove along the Ravenel Bridge, the skyline unfolding before me, sunlight glinting off the water. I realized I wasn't just breaking away from my family. I was building a life rooted in self-respect. For the first time in years, I wasn't surviving them. I was living without them. And that, I learned, is its own kind of peace. If you've ever had to rebuild yourself from the damage of your own family's expectations, you're not alone. And if Ethan's journey resonated with you even a little, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next story. Your support helps this community grow into a space where we can talk about boundaries, healing, and the strength it takes to walk away from what breaks you. Share your thoughts in the comments, where you're listening from, or how parts of this story hit home for you. You never know who you might help by speaking up. This story is a work of narrative adaptation created solely for entertainment, discussion, and reflection. Names, locations, and personal details have been altered or fictionalized to protect privacy. Any resemblance to real individuals or specific events is purely coincidental. The creators of this content do not encourage confrontation, legal action, or personal decisions based solely on fictional stories. Always seek professional guidance when dealing with family, financial, or legal conflicts. This content should not be imitated or used as a guide for real-world action under any circumstances.